Today we're going to talk about automating Excel from Access. And just quickly, I'm going to go over getting data from Excel into Access and getting data out of Access into Excel. But the majority of the presentation today will actually be about how to use the Excel object and manipulate Excel from Access. So just to, and hopefully this part is reviewed for you, and if not, we do have the notes here, which I will publish afterwards. To get data from Excel and Access, you want to use the external data. Having this open. Sorry. Oh, no, it is open. Try one more time here. Hold on just a second. There we go. You want to use the external data function, and through there, the section on the right, on the left rather, is import, and then you set Excel, and you just browse to your Excel file, select it, and then you can either leave it to import into a new table, which will be named the same as your tab or worksheet that you choose in Excel to import to, or you can append a copy to an existing table. So that's all there is to it, to manually go in and get data from Excel and pull it into either a new table or an existing table within Access. You can do the same thing programmatically. You can use in Visual Basic, the do command transfer spreadsheet command. That's got several parameters. You can actually use that command both for imports and exports. And here is the example of using it trying to import from Excel. You select the parameter AC import and the spreadsheet type, and I'll show you a different type in the export example. You put the table name that you want to either create new or append to. You don't use the brackets, but you do use the quotes. The brackets are to indicate that you would replace that with the actual table name that you were using. And then similarly, the full path and file name, including the extension of the spreadsheet that you want to import this into. And then true means whether or not you have column headers or not. Otherwise, it will use the things that are the column names, like column 1, 2, 3, if you don't have headers. And then, so here's a little bit more in detail about the parameters available for do command transfer spreadsheet, the different types for each of these. And I'm showing you the most common spreadsheet, 9 and 12, which are 2000 through 2003 or 2007 and beyond. There's also a optional range, and I'm going to show an example of that on the export, where if you don't want to put something in the first worksheet or in starting with A1, then you could put something like sheet 2 or whatever the name sheet in the spreadsheet you wanted it to be, or you can put a whole range of cells that you want to export to. To put data into Excel, of course, if you are working on an Access 2013 or 2016 web database, they have a built-in download into Excel button that's available on data sheets. That's a very easy way to get data from Access into Excel. Likewise, you can use the reverse of the import function, and I need to correct that. This is wrong. Apologize. I'll correct it before I save. You would use the export section. So external data, the export section, and then select Excel. And then similarly, you may browse to or set up the name of wherever you want to store it. You can choose the format in some older formats, like this would be the Spreadsheet 9 type format. And then usually you want to, when you have this, or in order to select this, you want to actually go to a specific table and have highlighted the table before you do that. Or the query, you can actually export query results as well. And then that will use that as a source. From programmatically from VBA, you would use the same command, do command transfer spreadsheet. This time it's AC export, and I show an example of type Excel 12. The name of the table or query in this case is possible, and the full path name, and true if you want the column headers to also be shown in your spreadsheet. And just like I mentioned on the previous slide here, you can use the optional range if you want to go to a different spreadsheet or worksheet that's not the same name as your table or query name, if you want to name it something else, or if you want to do things repetitively and maybe fill a couple worksheets in one workbook, you could do something like that. So to get to the meat of today's presentation, if you want to then manipulate either your Excel results from an export or some other Excel spreadsheet from Access, you would make use of the Excel application object. And you will find, if you go and just this here, if you go to Visual Basic and you look at View Object Browser, you don't have the Excel library available unless you go in and add as a reference the Microsoft Excel. You always want to use whatever the most recent one is, Object Library. Now, I show you this because linking to the Microsoft Excel Object Library then lets you look at things and query things in the object browser, and so that's very helpful while you're developing. But I do suggest that you don't or you disable that reference before you actually finish your code and send your code. If you're going to use this just for yourself, that's not necessary, but if you're going to deploy your Access application on client sites, it's much better not to have the actual referenced links. And the reason is that you might have Office 2013 and your client might have Office 27, and you want this to work for both without having to link in a different reference. And so if you follow some of the examples here where you are, instead of defining things like your application or your workbook as Excel application or Excel workbook, if you just define them as objects. You don't get the IntelliSense while you're developing, but you do get more portability. So you could, for example, on this first line here, dim OAP as object, you could use Excel.application instead of object, and just, like we've got here, and then later go back and change it to object, and you would have a little bit more IntelliSense when you're developing. But here are some of the things that you typically would want to do. You would want to, first of all, establish a reference point to the Excel application. And I always use create object that opens a new instance of Excel. That's safer to do, so that if they happen to have Excel already open, you're not risking, or you don't have as high of a risk of clobbering some other Excel workbook that they have open. So I use create object to open a new instance of the Excel application. And then the following line is to open an existing workbook. You would, and you would just, these other variables here that I have to save space, I did not define them, but you would define them just like the OAP. You'd do a dim O workbook as object. So you set the workbook to the Excel application that you have here, workbooks.open, and you put the full path and file name, including the extension. And I am going to show a real life instance of these things. I wanted to go through them briefly first, though, before we show the instances or the examples here. Other things to do, save a workbook with a new name. So the workbook that you have here, you would use that workbook and save as, and the full path and file name, including the extension. Now this assumes that you're saving with the same extension type. If you are not, if you are converting, say, from maybe a macro-enabled template of some kind, and then saving it as a XLSX form, then you would also add the optional parameter to indicate the type of workbook you're saving it as. Otherwise, you might end up with something that's not really a valid version of Excel. If you try to save a macro-enabled, you open a macro-enabled Excel workbook and you try to save it with extension XLSX, that's not going to work. You're not going to have a viable Excel file. So you have to make sure that you either save it with the same extension type or put in the correct type to save it as. Other useful things to do: close your spreadsheet if you do not want to leave it displayed, or workbook close. Activate a particular worksheet. Here again, you would define the O worksheet before you go and do this, and then also you would set the worksheet, and I will have an example of that, to one of the worksheets in the workbook. But you would activate a worksheet. You can also work with specific cells in the worksheet using O worksheet cells here. And it's also very useful to be able to find the last used row. And in this case, the example here is the last used row in column 1. So basically what this does here is figures out the maximum number of rows that are available in the worksheet. And then for column 1, it starts at the bottom and goes up until it finds a blank column, one row, and it returns that row. So this will not work if you have a data set that has blanks in between your source. or if you've got blanks in column 1, maybe you want to use another column number, one that doesn't have blanks ever. So this does depend, upon what your data set is like. And then another common thing is to do something like update the source data for a pivot table. And so you would use something like this. You would take the worksheet.pivottables and then put the pivot table name in there. The first pivot table you create is by default pivot table 1, unless you change it to something else. And you would want to then update the source data to the spreadsheet name or the worksheet name in this place, and then something like A1 through C, and then the ending number that you had computed up here. And then you actually have to execute a refresh command to get the pivot table to update based on the changed source data. So let me show you a couple of these things in an example. And in this particular example, I have a template. And so we work off a template. This template doesn't have any macro behind it. It's just an Excel spreadsheet. It's an XLS spreadsheet. It has 2 worksheets on it. It has a worksheet with data on it, and it's just 4 columns and a large range of data. And this is our sample. This particular sample happens to then have a particular chart, and the chart has some layout values. It has a label on here. The template was based off of corn futures, and then we are going to use this template in my example to update this chart and save it for a different type of futures. So I'm going to close that out here and bring back Access. And we've got this form here. Go to the code here for the form. So what we're going to do for this is when we go to a specific row here and choose it to view, and I think there's one here that I want to give as an example. This one is unleaded gasoline. And we hit this view button, then we're going to use information from this row to open that template and fill it with data for, instead of for corn, what the template was, we're going to fill it for data here from the unleaded gasoline source. So to do that, we're going to do that in this view click event. And notice that I have an Excel application object defined, and then I have an Excel workbook object defined. I'm going to go ahead and undo my reference here just so you know that it works without. The other thing that you have to do, my examples show different Excel constants, like Excel open XML workbook and Excel up. Those constants are not defined in Access. So if you are to bring in as a reference the Microsoft Excel reference, you don't have to define them. But if you leave that off, then any Excel constants you use, you do have to define. And you can find from the reference object what the actual values are. So I just simply, any values that I use, I set up constants with those values in my Access program so that I don't have to bring in the Excel reference. And then I've also got a workbook, and I apologize here. I'm actually, this is originally what this program does is all at once from the top, there's an update button that actually pulls in a data source from someplace else and updates access from that data source. And then you can choose to update as many templates as you have checked. You don't have to update them all. That's all one process that's run usually. And then the view in the actual application just opens the workbook. So here, if we were to have this commented out and these items, here, all this would do when we ran it would be to open up a workbook that has already been saved, and the workbook, will be called what we have in our row. So that's what those are left over from. So these are not really being used in this section here with it being commented, but we are going to do the same kind of thing here in this refresh Excel workbook routine, which sends in the commodity, the file name, and the commodity code for use here. So we do the same kind of things here. Here's the Excel application and the workbook, and then we've also defined a worksheet object. So just like we had in our example, the first thing to do is to open the Excel application, an instance of the Excel application. Then we open the workbook itself in this line. And notice how we have this set here. That's because those are objects. And so we are setting the objects. And since we're not creating new objects, we don't have to do like, in some instances you'll see where they do like as new, whatever. These are just pointers to other objects. This does create the object in this instance, so it's a little bit like doing a new. But, and then I'm going to save the workbook that I've opened, because the workbook that I opened is my template. And here we have the template file name, which I just put as a constant up here. And I'm assuming that that is in whatever directory we have defined where our template is. And that's something that happens to be up at the top of the main form. And actually, this is the results that you see. You don't see the other one, but the other one is hidden up here. But that's where that's gotten from. So we do a save as. We're using the directory and then the file, which the file includes the spreadsheet name. Like you can see here, it will be saved as unlgas.slx. And the reason that I used these two lines before is so that if this already exists, we are not going to pop up with a warning that says, do you want to overwrite it? If you left those off, then you would get a warning if it already existed, and you would need to go in and answer yes to that. But if you were doing this for, like a lot of things in a row, or repeatedly month after month, like is in the case of the usual usage here, then you would not want to take care of that. So then the next thing I'm going to do is clear out old data from the composite tab. And the composite tab is this other tab that we saw that has just the data. So I'm going to set the worksheet variable here to worksheets composite, and then activate that through this line here. And then I'm going to get what the last used row is. And if there's nothing in it at all, then I don't want to clear out my header row So that's why I have this test to say if the last row is greater than 1. Then I select the whole range here and then clear out what the contents. So this just erases what's in there. It doesn't actually delete the rows, but it clears out the rows. So they would be unused. And then I want to put data from my query. So here I use a record set object, and I open a specific query with the market code that we brought in. So I open that record set, and then I use copy from record set. And this copies the whole results here. And it starts at row 2, column 1, and just pastes all at once into Excel the results of that record set. And then I want to update my range in the chart. So the last row may not be the same now as it was before, because who knows what was in the template before. So I again need to do the same command to find the last row. And then similar to what I showed you with the pivot source data, these next rows, or code rows, commands rather, update the collection values and the ranges in the chart so that it sets up the column headers and the ranges for that and where to look at for it. So I'll just go ahead and let me see at the end here we may have, oh, and also the chart title I update, and then I activate the chart and save the workbook. And in this case, I've already saved it as at the beginning here, right up here. So I have the right workbook name and type and everything like that. So I'm just going to do a plain save. And then I'm going to clean up, set my warnings back to true, and also then set the Excel application to visible. Because when you create do the create object Excel application in Access, the default is to not have that be visible. And while we're doing the work here, I really don't want it visible, because if it were visible, you would see like flashing on the screen as things were working. So that keeps all that in the background, and at the end then I set the visible to true, and that then will show us the results here. So let's go ahead and run that, and you can see then what happens. And so see here we have unleaded gasoline instead, and we have a different chart than what our template was. It's actually updated the range here, the high and low, and the values of the dates. I know it's not very pretty, but you can do stuff like that. You can update the source behind a pivot table, and show then the pivot table in Excel. Excel just has a lot more presentation capabilities than Access does. The reporting is limited in Access, and so that's why it's nice to use, as an interface. Let me just go back here then to clean up what else we're going to talk about. Some other tips about automating Excel from Access. Without knowing Excel VBA, and maybe you do, but if you do not, one of the quickest ways to figure out what Excel methods you want to use is to actually record a macro in Excel. And hopefully you know how to do that. Let me just show you briefly if you do not. If you go into Developer, you can select Record Macro, and then you can do things, like say we wanted to go in here, sorry. And we wanted to change the name of our chart. And we want to, delete this. And then you go back to developer and you stop recording. And then you can go into the Visual Basic behind the spreadsheet, and under modules, you were able to name it. The default's always module 1, but then you can see the methods that were used from Excel. And I will warn you that the macros that are recorded, when you see big width blocks like this, they even if things are not changed, they use all the possible methods here. And so if the only thing you did was one thing, then changing the font or whatever, then you might just choose, what you did. You might just choose the line or lines of here, like if you had set it to bold and it wasn't bold before. You wouldn't necessarily need to do all of these lines. In fact, in this particular example, the only thing I actually did was this one here. I didn't. The other stuff that we have here is, I did do the chart title, select, and then set the text like this. But you could probably actually just do this line right here, and that's the only one you would really need. But at least it gives you a start if you record the macro, so you know a little bit about where you want to go and what you want to do, even if what you're going to do is then use what you find in your macro to go back and look up those particular methods. It's very useful sometimes. So then you can copy the code in from the macro or some of the code, and then add the, make sure you add the with a worksheet or whatever kind of object and end around it. Because if you notice in Excel, they're talking here about like active chart or the active sheet or whatever. You would want to use, instead of sheets, chart 1, you would want to use like your O worksheet object, because you're not physically in Excel VBA, you're in Access VBA, and you're accessing it from there. So you do want to replace that, or those pieces from the copied code. Do be very careful about using the Excel active sheet and active workbook. I just find it a lot safer to actually make specific variables and point to them, set them to the whatever worksheet by name or workbook by name that you want, and use those references. The active sheet and active workbook can just get pretty dangerous if they have other workbooks open, and maybe you have a couple step process where you do one thing and then they happen to do that, and then they go over and get interrupted with a phone call and go to a different workbook, and then they come back and they use something else. If you happen to be sharing an Excel application instead of having 2 different instances of it open, you can be on the wrong one, or the one that you don't think you are, if they've done some work in between. So I try to avoid the use of that from Access. And then lastly, I just have my contact information, and I'd like to open it up for questions. Let's see if we can figure out how to unmute our attendees here. Trying to use Skype here. So it looks like a couple of you are unmuted, and some, or maybe you're called in. I'm going to see if I can unmute you guys? No, maybe not. So if you have a question, I think that you can unmute yourself in Skype and or start in the conversation here. All right, let's try that one more time. I did get some prompt that maybe said that somebody was trying to unmute themselves, and I think I had to give them permission to do that. So if you tried to unmute yourself to ask a question and weren't successful, try one more time.
I have been able to unmute everybody except someone
good.
that's called in. There's one that's called in. I can't unmute.
Okay, great. All right, well then I will assume that no one has any questions, and so we will go ahead and end for today. But I thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to having you join us again next month. And do feel free also to look at some of the other groups. I know that I'm not sure whether any of them have spoken about integrating with Excel, but they do different topics, and most of those are in the evening time. But feel free to take a look if they have done something in the past. We have recordings. If they're going to end up doing something in the future, or if you have more questions about Excel, please feel free to drop us a line, and we'll try to answer more of those questions in a future meeting. Thank you so much.